Hey there, I'm Josh, and today I'm going to be just joshing around customizing Boba Fett's Slave 1. These are the products that I used to paint and finish the project. And the whole thing took me between 5 and 6 hours to complete. I suppose when it comes to piggybacking off the popularity of The Mandalorian, I'm a little bit late to the party here. But anyway, here we are. A few months ago, my best friend mentioned that they got this Slave 1 ship for their little boy. And he asked me if I'd like to customize it, to which I replied, and while I was at it, I figured I'd go ahead and spruce up the one that I got for my little boy as well. As you can see between the two of them, there's quite a difference. Well, with the finish at least. The molds for each of them are exactly the same, and I couldn't find any discernible difference. Which is all the more interesting due to the fact that these things were manufactured 15 years apart and by different companies. As you can see, the older, less detailed one was made back in 1981 by Kenner, while the newer one was made in 96 by Hasbro. So, you know.
That's pretty neat!
Anyway, you better get a good look now, because things are about to change. The first thing I did was to take off all the removable pieces. I briefly thought about disassembling the ships entirely, but ultimately I decided against it. Once everything was apart, I went to work on removing the stickers from the older ship. This ship is where I spent the bulk of my time for this project, and you're going to see why. First, I tried scraping and picking at the decals to remove them, but this didn't really work very well, so I switched to sandpaper, which also didn't really work very well. So then, I tried a wet scour sponge, and I had a little bit better luck with that, but still not quite good enough. So, I decided that this ship was in desperate need of a bath. I left it fully immersed in hot soapy water for probably about an hour or so, and then went to work once again on removing all the decals. This did prove to be the best method, but I still had to work quite a bit in removing all the residue from all the old decals. Another thing I could have tried was maybe using a solvent of some sort, but I really didn't want to leave any other residue on this thing for painting. So the hot soapy water ended up working out great. While I was letting that ship dry thoroughly, I went ahead and applied a clear coat to seal in all of the stickers and decals on the newer ship. I did this in the hopes that when I applied the shoe polish for weathering, I wouldn't ruin all the decals. And while I was at it, I went ahead and applied one coat of gray primer to the bottom side of the ship as well. For the older ship, I'll be using multiple layers of paint. I started with primer to, prime it, being sure to cover it from every angle on both the top and the bottom. Next, I used some leftover cream-colored chalk paint to apply a base coat to everything but the bottom of the ship. This stuff covers really well, and it has a nice matte finish, which is exactly what I was looking for. Once that was done and dry, I masked off the appropriate areas and switched over to a red wine-colored spray paint. I applied a thin coat to the base of the ship and then quickly began the weathering process. I emphasize quickly because I had to start doing this while the paint was still tacky. To accomplish this weathering technique, I poured some lacquer thinner into a cup and then very sparingly applied it to specific areas of the paint. Since the red paint wasn't completely set up yet, it was really easy to remove it from the areas that I wanted. Throughout this entire project, I was continuously referencing a bunch of different source pictures, because I was trying to match the details as closely as I could. But I couldn't find 100% consistency across everything, so I just kind of came up with my own designs while loosely basing it on all of the designs. Regardless, as you'll come to see, this thing's going to start looking pretty old and beat up, while of course still looking tough and intimidating, like the man himself. Once all the red parts were done, I modified the masking on the entire ship and then applied a dark green spray paint to the appropriate areas. I then repeated the same weathering technique using the lacquer thinner once again to wear away some of the paint in certain spots. While I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what I know about Boba Fett. Back when I was growing up, like the majority of people, I really didn't know a lot about him as a character. I just thought he looked really cool and had a pretty sweet ship. But like, for real, all we really saw of him was that he showed up as a bounty hunter looking for Han Solo, then he gets him, takes him back to Jabba, and unceremoniously seems to die in a Sarlacc pit. So, other than looking really cool and intimidating, he really didn't do much in the original movies. But it wasn't until years later, through stories that expanded on the mythos and the background of the character, that I found out just how formidable and awesome he actually is. And of course, the Attack of the Clones film really helped to expand on that as well, with the revelation that he is a direct, unaltered clone of Jango Fett, a legendary bounty hunter in his own right. And then we got various appearances of young Boba in the Star Wars Clone Wars series too. But honestly, what really made me appreciate him as a character was hearing about all of the old expanded universe stories about him. Stories that I didn't actually ever even read. But I did, however, have every vivid, excruciating detail recounted to me by two of my best friends, who happen to be hands down the two biggest Star Wars geeks that I've ever known. Seriously, it's how I would imagine it is to be best friends with both Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, except, without the professionalism. Anyway, the point is that they really made me appreciate Boba Fett as a character, so that's pretty cool. So it really made me psyched out of my mind when they teased and then included him in the newest season of The Mandalorian. We finally got verification that he didn't actually die in that Sarlacc pit. But more so, even without the aid of his armor, we got to see just how vicious and formidable he is. Which made the scene when he gets his armor back even more satisfying, because he just shows up and kicks so much more butt. Seriously, that show is so good. And on top of how cool of a character he is just by himself, we got to see even more of just how awesome his ship is. Speaking of which, the Slave One is a modified Firespray 31 patrol and attack ship that was designed and manufactured by Kuat Systems Engineering. It was originally used to guard the prison moon of Uvo 4. Or Uovo 4, I'm not really sure how to say it. Regardless, you get the point. Anyways, it was stolen at some point by Jango Fett, who modified it and added quite a bit of weaponry and technological upgrades to it. It remained in his possession until his death, at which time it passed on to his clone son Boba. From that point, it's remained in Boba's possession, other than a brief hiatus in which it was used by pragmatic space pirate Hondo Anaka. Over the years, Boba went on to make even more modifications and upgrades, proving to ensure that his ship would not be one to be taken lightly, which is plainly evident by the most recent appearances we saw in The Mandalorian, where we witnessed that Boba Fett truly and literally is a master of his craft. By the way, back to the project. I can't explain how completely satisfying it is to pull away all of the masking tape off this thing and just see everything come together. It's just a really cool feeling. After removing the tape, I realized that I made a mistake. I forgot to paint the small panel on the front the dark green color. So I just sprayed some into a cup and brushed it on. Once that was done, I applied one coat of brilliant aluminum spray paint to the tail guns. And I apologize for the camera angle. It was pretty difficult to film this part for some reason. Now, for the viewport, this thing was in pretty rough shape. So I took some very fine steel wool and buffed it both on the outside and then the inside. Once that was done, I applied some paste wax to both sides and then buffed it really well to give it a nice sheen. Next, I grabbed a small paintbrush to apply some flat black paint to add some scorch marks and battle damage from blaster fire. I did this sparingly to only a few areas on the ship. Once that was done, I moved to the next phase of weathering, which involves, of course, shoe polish. I mainly stuck with the brown stuff this time to get the appearance that I was wanting. Though I did use a little bit of a combination of brown, black, and powdered graphite to give the appearance of extra dirt and soot. Once the weathering process was pretty much complete, I switched to adding some details to the bottom of the ship. To do this, I used several different mixtures of paint and only applied it to key areas. Starting first with this tannish colored paint, and then switching over to the next mixture, which is a combination of sky blue and gray. I once again applied this only to specific areas. I then switched to a copper color to paint the exterior of the jets. For the inner part of the jets, I used a combination of flat white and flat yellow. My intention was to make the jets look like they were fired up, as if this thing was in flight. Once all the detail work was done, it was time to weather the bottom of the ship. To accomplish this, I used a thick mixture of black shoe polish and powdered graphite. I applied it pretty heavily and only wiped away a little bit of the excess. Now, it was time to put everything back together. I first pushed the tail guns back into place, which, by the way, I did do a small amount of weathering on them, I just didn't film it. Next, before reinstalling the viewport, I had to make sure the pilot was in place. Once I secured the viewport, this ship was complete. Now, for the other ship, since this thing already has so much detail on it, all I really had to do was add some detail to the bottom of the ship, and then add some weathering and some scorch marks, and that was pretty much it. Which means that both ships are now done. When I started this project, I only intended on fixing up and restoring some old toys for some kids. But somewhere along the line, as it often happens with me, I got a little bit carried away. And now we're left with a couple of ships that I could easily see as cool collectibles sitting on a shelf. I can truly say that I'm very pleased with the results on both of these ships, especially on this one that required a total repaint. And even though this one didn't require nearly as much time and effort, I'm still thrilled with knowing that the addition of just a bit of paint and weathering really makes an improvement. And it's always definitely cool to see the progression from before to now. This project was a lot of fun to work on, especially because I got to do both of these ships in different ways. This one was the far easier of the two because all I really had to do was add a little bit of weathering to spruce it up. And even though this one took a lot longer to do, I wouldn't exactly say it was difficult. It was actually a lot of fun to try to come up with the different ways to make the paint look like it was worn away. All in all, I'm pretty pleased with how this project turned out, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to leave a like below and consider subscribing. That's it for this one, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.